The story begins with the slow rhythm of a wireless room at sea. Not a dramatic environment, not a place anyone expected to make history. Just a narrow space on a small escort ship in the North Atlantic, crowded with cables, headphones, and the constant hum of vacuum tubes warming the air. The man inside the room was leading radio operator Thomas Hale, someone the rest of the crew barely noticed. He wasn't a gunner, he wasn't on the bridge, he wasn't part of the depth charge party on the stern. He was simply the person who listened, hour after hour, day after day. The crew joked that he was born with headphones on. In truth, Hale preferred the company of radio static more than people. It was early 1943, the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic. The German U-boat fleet was still confident. Allied convoys stretched across the ocean, slow and vulnerable. Escorts worked in small groups, struggling to defend them. Surface ships, aircraft and radar helped, but the real battlefield was invisible. It existed in the spaces between dots and dashes, short bursts of sound that carried deadly meaning. Every U-boat commander knew the rules of radio silence. They were trained to transmit as little as possible, and when they did, to use precise formats approved by the Kriegsmarine. Any deviation from those patterns could reveal position, convoy bearing, or operational movement. Hale knew this too. He spent more time reading captured radio manuals than sleeping. Morse patterns, signal spacing, key-click signatures, he memorized everything. He knew German operators by their habits. One tapped a little too softly at the end of each message. Another dragged the dashes slightly long. To Hale, these quirks were voices. He recognized them quicker than faces. But the real turning point began with something that didn't look important. It was 200 hours when he heard it, a fragment of Morse code buried in heavy static. At first he thought it was atmospheric interference. Winter storms often made the band chaotic, but then he heard the rhythm, clear enough to stand out, fast enough to be purposeful. It wasn't part of any Allied traffic, and the spacing was wrong for a Soviet or neutral commercial signal. The message was short, almost too short. Just a string of characters repeated twice, then silence. Hale wrote it down automatically. That was routine. But routine gave way to curiosity when he realized what he had just copied. The structure matched a forbidden format, a message German U-boat operators were specifically ordered not to use because intelligence officers believed it could be tracked. Hale had seen references to it only once, in a barely legible intelligence circular. Most operators would have forgotten it, but Hale never forgot anything. The forbidden format was a relic from early war communication doctrine, banned because it created a predictable fingerprint. It was designed for quick coordination during wolfpack movements, but abandoned when the Allies started exploiting it. Yet here it was again, in February 1943, when the U-boats were supposedly strict about their procedures. Hale leaned back in his chair. The ship rocked gently in the dark sea. Everyone else was asleep or on quiet watch. He lifted the headphones slightly off one ear and listened again. Nothing, just the ocean of static, but the short burst haunted him. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't noise, it was disciplined, intentional tapping. And if one German operator had broken procedure, there could be a reason. He logged the event in the ship's signal ledger. Not dramatic, not a warning, just unusual Morse pattern detected, resembles prohibited format 204 hours. He signed his name and continued listening. For the next hour, the airwaves remained silent. Then at 3:21 hours, another signal appeared, this time weak but clearer, the same operator, the same spacing. And this time a small detail gave it away, the operator's dot length. Hale recognized it immediately. It was a transmitter he had only heard twice before, months earlier, when a U-boat had been spotted off Iceland. That boat was never sunk, it simply vanished. Hale wrote another line in the ledger, a second anomaly. This was enough to interest him, but not enough to alert the officers. Radio men were supposed to gather information, not interpret it. Interpretation belonged to intelligence staff hundreds of miles away, but Hale had always believed that a man at sea, listening in real time, could understand patterns faster than a desk officer reading weekly reports. At 4:15 hours, the third signal arrived, and this one changed everything. It was faint, fading in and out as if the transmitter were damaged or far away. Hale leaned forward, adjusting the receiver's tuning knob until the signal sharpened. He copied the characters mechanically. Halfway through the message, he froze. The operator repeated a prefix 3 times. A prefix that appeared only when U-boats coordinated convoy attacks. A prefix used exclusively for wolfpacks. But wolfpacks required multiple U-boats, and multiple U-boats meant communication chatter, not isolated lone signals. If the operator was invoking that prefix, then he wasn't alone. Hale circled the prefix in red pencil. His hands were steady, but his stomach felt heavy. Something was wrong, and then he understood what was wrong. The prefix wasn't only part of wolfpack doctrine. It was part of the old doctrine, the same doctrine connected to the forbidden Morse pattern. And there was only one reason a U-boat radio man would revert to that outdated system. A pack of submarines was forming, but they were taught to keep silent. If they transmitted normally, they risked detection. But using short, band signals allowed them to coordinate without following the alignment rules that made them predictable. It was a loophole. A dangerous loophole. And Hale had just stumbled into it. He pulled out his earlier logs, comparing the signal bursts. The rhythm matched perfectly. 3 transmissions, 1 operator, 1 old system, but that wasn't what concerned him most. What concerned him was the time interval. Each message arrived 40 to 60 minutes apart, spaced across the night, coming from the same general direction. That pattern didn't reflect one submarine. It reflected a line. If U-boats were spaced apart in a search line, they could sweep entire sectors of the Atlantic looking for convoys, and Hale's convoy was moving directly into one of those sectors. He grabbed the plotting sheet from the desk drawer. Hale wasn't a navigator, but he knew enough radio mathematics to estimate bearings. He marked 3 rough lines on the chart, each based on the signal quality and directionality of the antenna. When he connected the marks, they formed an arc. A wide arc. Too wide for one submarine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood. There weren't just 1 or 2 U-boats out there. There were many. Possibly an entire wolfpack. He leaned forward, studying the lines, recalculating, checking again. Every adjustment made the result worse. The arc suggested not a random distribution, but a coordinated formation. He counted the spacing. He counted again. There could be 20 U-boats positioned across the convoy route. For a moment, Hale said nothing. He simply stared at the sheet, listening to the soft hum of the radio. Outside, the sea was quiet. Rain tapped lightly against the metal hull. The engines throbbed at a steady pace. Nothing outside reflected the danger he saw on the page. He pulled off his headphones and walked to the bridge. Most officers disliked being disturbed at night, but Hale didn't care. He approached the watch officer and placed the plotting sheet on the table. The officer scanned it, confused. Hale explained the signals calmly, not dramatically. He showed the timing, the spacing, the forbidden Morse structure, the implications. When he finished, the officer frowned. "You're telling me one radio operator out there is using an outdated message format," he said. "And from that, you think there are 20 submarines?" Hale nodded. The officer hesitated. It sounded impossible. It sounded like overanalysis. But Hale's reputation as a meticulous operator worked in his favor. The officer agreed to inform the captain. Minutes later, the captain arrived. Hale repeated everything. The captain studied the sheet in silence. At last, he said only this: "If you're right, we're sailing into a trap." Hale nodded again. The captain turned to the navigation crew. "Signal the other escorts, alter course immediately, keep radio silence." The order spread through the ship, engines adjusted, the convoy shifted direction. Back in the radio room, Hale listened again. This time he heard not 3 signals, but 5. 5 distinct operators, all using the same forbidden structure. The radio room aboard the destroyer had never felt smaller. The low ceiling hummed with vibration from the engines, and the metal bulkheads amplified every footstep, every shift of equipment, every distant call from the bridge. For most radio men, the space was simply another compartment. For the man now seated in front of the receiver, it was a battlefield all its own. He leaned closer to the headphones as the strange signal repeated again. The pattern was unmistakable now, a sequence of grouped pulses, each spaced by a precise interval, each followed by a brief, barely audible hiss of static. He recognized that hiss. It was the telltale artifact of a German transmitter operating at low power, somewhere across the Atlantic. But what made the signal impossible to ignore was its rhythm. It was not a standard naval message, not a weather report, not a convoy tracking broadcast. It was something else, something he had heard before months earlier during a late-night monitoring shift when a German operator mistakenly tapped an encoded call sign using the wrong procedure. That tiny mistake had revealed the enemy's presence. Now that same rhythm was returning across the Atlantic, but this time it was deliberate. He scanned the frequency again, adjusting the gain just enough to catch the weaker edges of the transmission. The sound rose and fell like breathing. It was coming from a moving source. Whoever was sending it wasn't stationary. That meant only one thing: a patrol submarine shifting position. He made a quick handwritten note, recording the frequency, time, and pattern length. The destroyer shuddered slightly beneath him as it cut through the waves. He barely noticed. His entire focus was fixed on the strange sequence. As the signal repeated a third time, the pattern finally clicked into place. It wasn't a distress call. It wasn't a request for bearings. It wasn't even an internal Kriegsmarine code. It was a coordination marker. He froze. Coordination markers were used only when multiple U-boats operated in close proximity. Wolfpack tactics relied heavily on tight synchronization, precise vector timing, speed adjustments, and shared kill assignments. For such coordination, German operators often used short, encrypted bursts that Allied codebreakers couldn't crack fast enough to prevent attacks. But this signal wasn't encrypted, not fully. It carried an incomplete structure, suggesting the sender intended it as a reference mark, not a full message. The Germans believed no Allied radio man would recognize it for what it was. They were wrong. He grabbed the fresh message sheet and typed a short note to the intelligence officer, but before he could summon the runner, a new sound forced him to stop. The signal shifted slightly, drifting downward in frequency by a nearly imperceptible amount. Only someone with his attention for microscopic detail would notice. A drifting frequency always meant the submarine was turning. He adjusted the dial, following the shift, as if he were tracing the submarine's movement through water. This wasn't just a random U-boat contacting headquarters. The operator was coordinating with nearby submarines and repositioning at the same time. That could only mean the Wolfpack was preparing for something immediate. Convoys, troop transports, fuel tankers, munitions carriers, somewhere ahead in the Atlantic, something valuable was moving through the sea lanes. The radio man straightened in his seat. He had to determine direction. Without direction, the signal was only noise. Interesting, suspicious noise, but useless to the escorts guarding the Atlantic convoys. He lowered the gain and tested the signal's strength. It weakened slightly when he angled the antenna away from the port side. That meant the source lay approximately to starboard, farther out into the open ocean. He ran a quick calculation in his head, estimating distance based on signal decay and the known tendencies of German transmitters. The shape of the wolf pack was revealing itself, not through visual sighting or sonar pings, but through radio physics alone. He recorded a second set of notes. If he was right, the Germans weren't just coordinating among nearby submarines. They were preparing for a mass interception. The rhythm, the drifting frequency, the spacing of the pulses, all of it pointed to a timed rendezvous. A wolf pack attack window. The destroyer suddenly lurched as water crashed against the bow, knocking a pencil off the table. The radio man steadied himself, retrieved the pencil, and returned to the receiver without a second thought. He replayed the pattern inside his head, counting each beat, comparing each cluster of dots and dashes. Something bothered him. The pattern was familiar, but not in the normal sense. He had seen it somewhere, not heard it. Not in a transmission log or an intercepted code sheet, but in an intelligence summary delivered months earlier. It was a pattern the Royal Navy specifically instructed radio men never to use. A forbidden alignment, too similar to an old British fisheries signal that could be confused with naval emergency codes. The German operator was using a pattern specifically discouraged by Allied doctrine. The realization sent a shock through him. If he recognized the pattern because he had once seen it on a forbidden list, then perhaps the Germans were using it for the same reason Allied operators avoided it, because it blended into normal commercial traffic. They were hiding a wolf pack coordination signal inside what looked like meaningless interference. It was brilliant and dangerous. He began plotting the signals onto a map grid marking approximate bearings. One signal, then another. Then the frequency drifted again, leading him to add a third marker. Slowly, the positions formed a line. His heart quickened. U-boats didn't move in lines unless they were forming a barrier. A barrier meant only one thing. A convoy was approaching from the east or northeast. The submarines were positioning themselves to intercept it at dusk or just after moonrise. He didn't know which convoy, but he knew the pattern. The spacing between signals meant the wolf pack was unusually large, much larger than average. The Germans had committed multiple boats to a single attack route. He stood and carried the message sheet to the intelligence officer's quarters. The officer read the notes, glanced at the map and frowned. He asked him to repeat the analysis from the beginning. The radio man explained the signal drift, the pulse timing, the forbidden Morse alignment. The officer listened in silence. Then he reached for a ledger and flipped through pages of known U-boat signatures. When he reached a particular page, he stopped. There it was. The same spacing, the same rhythm, the same incomplete format. A coordination marker used by a wolf pack known as Grupp Haifisch, shark group, responsible for sinking dozens of Allied ships earlier in the war. The officer lifted his head slowly. His expression changed. If this was Haifisch, then the convoy at risk was one of the largest scheduled to cross that sector in weeks. He grabbed the radio man's notes, folded them, and hurried for the bridge. The radio man returned to his receiver. The signal continued to drift. The German operator repeated the pattern, now slightly faster, as if urgency were building. More faint signals appeared on nearby frequencies, some overlapping, some spaced apart by long, static-filled gaps. 20 signals. He counted them twice. 20 distinct U-boats. A wolf pack larger than anything he had ever encountered. And he was the only man in the room who knew exactly what their signals meant. He pressed his headphones tighter and listened, waiting for the next clue, because now more than ever every second mattered. The signals kept coming. Not quickly, not carelessly, not like an operator panicking under pressure. Whoever was tapping those patterns across the Atlantic understood the one rule every submariner learned early: anything too regular becomes predictable, and anything predictable becomes lethal. So the dots and dashes arrived in irregular waves, a few minutes here, a gap there, a fragment, a pause as if the sender had stopped to listen for danger. Then another fragment, always short, always stripped of meaning unless you knew the pattern he was stitching together behind it, and only one man did. Baker recognized the rhythm before he understood the content. It was the same rhythm Morse instructors drilled into recruits' learning to keep messages short, clean, and untraceable. Except this one wasn't clean, it wasn't official, it wasn't legal by Navy standards. Entire sections broke the communications handbook. A handful of pulses didn't even belong to the Morse canon at all, but they weren't mistakes. Each one belonged exactly where it was placed. The signaler wasn't transmitting words, he was transmitting locations. Every deviation, every pause, every extra pulse was a marker in a grid only two men were supposed to understand: the anonymous operator out there somewhere in the North Atlantic, and the American radio man now decoding him in this silent coastal room. 20 positions, 20 distinct shifts, 20 separate presences moving beneath the Atlantic winter. 20 U-boats. And every single one of them was dangerously close to the convoy routes America and Britain depended on. Baker didn't let himself feel the weight of it. He kept working, stripping each fragment down to its structural pulse, comparing it against his notebook of pattern lengths and offsets. His pencil moved in short, clipped strokes. The room around him faded into the background. It was only him and the ether now. He replayed each burst inside his headphones, separating noise from intention. Static crackled like distant fire. Polar scatter distorted the edges of tones into jagged echoes. But then, beneath all that, the same confident hand would cut through the interference with a cluster of taps that carried no uncertainty. Baker marked them down one by one, building the invisible map the unknown operator was sketching from the other side of the ocean. When he reached the 15th signal, he stopped. This one was different, not wrong, just hurried, not panicked, just compressed, as if the sender needed to hide something inside fewer pulses than usual. Baker leaned closer, shifting the dial a fraction until the signal sharpened. A shorter rhythm, a clipped series, a pause, then another short burst layered too tightly to be coincidence. It reminded him of a distress call. But it wasn't a distress call at all. It was a warning. Baker wrote it down carefully, replayed it twice more, and then underlined it. The meaning wasn't obvious, not yet, but the sender wanted him to see it. And then the line went dead. Not faded, not weakened, not buried under atmospheric noise. Dead. As if someone had reached over, pulled the plug from the wall, and walked away forever. Baker waited 5 minutes, 10, 15. He checked the dials, retuned the band, scanned the adjacent frequencies. He widened the sweep and circled back. The silence stayed. The operator was gone. But his map was not. Baker reviewed everything again, every mark, every note, every coordinate embedded inside those illegal, forbidden patterns. A radio man wasn't supposed to track hostile submarines. That job belonged to Navy intelligence and anti-submarine command, but the Navy didn't even know this man existed. Whoever he was, he had just handed Baker the entire structure of a U-boat wolfpack, the biggest he had ever seen. 20 submarines moving in converging arcs, 20 separate runs angled toward Conv, lanes thick with fuel tankers, troop transports, ammunition carriers, and merchant ships. Baker didn't know whether the man on the other end had risked his life to send him this. He didn't know whether the last abrupt cutoff meant he'd been captured, discovered, or sunk, but he did know one thing. Those submarines were not drifting. They were hunting. And the convoys did not know. Baker gathered everything into a single sheet, no names, no messages, just patterns, and took it straight to the duty officer. The man barely glanced at it before shaking his head. Unverified, anonymous, no official identifier, no authentication pattern, we can't act on this. Baker kept his voice level. Sir, it's 20 U-boats. Or it's nothing, or it's an enemy deception, or it's a misinterpretation. Radio men hear ghosts when they listen too long, you know that. Baker did know, every operator did. Hours alone in static could turn random interference into imagined meaning. But this wasn't imagined. This was the work of a trained, disciplined, and deeply experienced hand. He tried again. Sir, the pattern structure is irrelevant. You bring me a Navy authentication prefix, I respond. Until then, it goes nowhere. Baker stood there for a moment, staring at the man behind the desk. The officer wasn't cruel or careless. He was simply bound by procedure designed to prevent panic, misinformation, and enemy manipulation. But procedure was going to get men killed. He walked out without arguing further. He didn't slam the door. He didn't speak to anyone in the hallway. He returned to his station, closed the door, and sat back down in the dim hum of the equipment. The headphones waited. The dial waited. The Atlantic waited. He checked the frequency again. Still silent. The unknown operator wasn't coming back. Baker looked at the map one more time. Every mark led toward a point in the sea where, if the timing was right, a major convoy had just passed through sunset and entered the dark. He needed confirmation, anything, a second transmission, a delay pattern, a partial repeat, some sign the operator was still alive. Nothing came. So Baker made a decision no radio man was supposed to make. He tuned the band not to listen, but to answer. He tapped once, a short, soft pulse, then a second, then a third. Not a message, not a phrase, just an acknowledgement, a signal into the dark that only one man would understand if he was still out there. Baker waited. And then faint, fragile, almost swallowed by static, something tapped back. Not words, not locations, just a single repeated pulse. The operator wasn't dead. He was signaling urgency.